Welcome to the third episode of MFRR in Focus news webinar. Media Freedom Rapid Response Consortium partners bring you this news webinar on a monthly basis. We are starting with a slightly good news. The immediate crisis in Slovenia has been averted. The MFRR has focused quite a lot on the STA funding crisis in Slovenia in previous periods, and signing of the contract, which ends the immediate financial crisis at the Slovenian Press Agency, was a positive development. However, we also need to state that there are still concerns that the current conditions of the deal could leave the agency in a financially weaker position and compromise its editorial independence. Again, from Slovenia, RTV Slovenia, the controversial reform plans led to protests from the staff targeting the management, cancelling a whole series of news programs, thereby reducing its ability to inform the public and scrutinize power. Then we proceed to Poland. After revealing Ministry of Justice representatives' involvement in leading a hate campaign in 2019, journalist Eva Sidlečka was faced with a criminal defamation case, ordering the journalist to pay monetary fine, a compensation for plaintiffs, payment to National Treasury, and cost of the trial. Again in Poland, journalist Katarina Lotkowska refused to comply with a request that would set a dangerous precedent for ethical journalism. She is being asked to reveal her sources in the case of a publication and is being threatened with imprisonment. This development not only puts her in danger, but also has a chilling effect on the journalistic community in Poland. And another dangerous potential precedent would be the recent developments in Malta, where the anonymization of court judgments under disguise of protecting citizens' right to privacy and protection of personal information hinders journalists reporting in the public interests and citizens' right to access accurate and reliable information in a timely manner. The MFRR has published an open letter addressed to the Maltese Prime Minister, Dr. Robert Abela, and Minister of Justice, Dr. Edward Zemet-Leves. You may read this letter on mfrr.eu. Violence targeting journalists did not cease in the past month either. 4 journalists in France who were covering the protests against COVID-19 rules and civil unrest in Martinique were fired upon 3 times during their coverage. You may find further information on these developments in our newsletter, and you may check our website mfrr.eu to read the joint statements on press and media freedom violations. Finally, we would also like to remind you that today is December 10, 2021, the Human Rights Day, as well as the day when Nobel Peace Prize is being awarded. This year, Nobel Peace Prize is being awarded to 2 journalists, Maria Ressa and Dmitry Muratov, for their efforts to safeguard freedom of expression and a precondition for democracy and lasting peace. And there has also taken place another significant development in the past month, which we will go into further detail. In Finland, a country famed for its high levels of press freedom, 3 journalists have been charged with disclosing state secrets. Oliver Monikerl is going to join us from IPI. Welcome, Oliver. Could you please tell us more regarding what has happened in Finland?
Yes, thanks very much, Gürkan. Well, look, this story started about 4 years ago in December 2017, when Finland's leading newspaper, the Helsingin Sanomat, published a series of articles about government plans to extend the powers of the secret services, particularly regards to surveillance powers and operational matters. And this was, clearly in the public interest about powers of how we are governed. The next day, one of the journalists involved, Laura Halvinen, her home was raided. The police took away her computers and laptops and everything else. And an investigation was launched in which 5 journalists from the newspaper, including the editor-in-chief, Kais Niemi, and the managing editor, Ezo Makinen, were all named as suspects. And as a consequence, they haven't been able to sort of talk about the case really until a month ago, when finally, to the journalist's surprise, the prosecutors decided to press charges against 3 of the journalists involved. And effectively, they've been charged with not only disclosing state secrets, but also planning to disclose state secrets. Now, according to Helsing and Sanomat, they defend their position by insisting that all of the information that was published was in the public domain and therefore not a state secret. The information gathered was all gathered legally, and that's been confirmed as the investigation because they were looking into that, and they've confirmed that the information was not illegally gathered, and that quite self-evidently this information is absolutely in the public interest, and therefore the newspaper and the journalists had a duty to report it. And now the trial is expected to start next year, and 3 journalists are facing possibly up to 4 years in jail.
What is the legal basis for the prosecution, though, and how is this expected to unfold in the coming period?
Well, that's really interesting. It appears that the case is being based on a 1995 law that was designed really to stop military personnel from selling military secrets to potentially hostile forces. So that's what the law is designed for. And it appears what's happening is that the law is being stretched to take on journalists disclosing information that may be embarrassing to the military. That at least is one theory. So that seems to be what's happening. But essentially, what we expect to see is that this will be a test case of how this law can be applied and how far they can apply it. So we could imagine, or we certainly anticipate, that if the journalists are condemned in the first court, that it will go to the High Court and then eventually to the Supreme Court. But that, of course, could take up to 5 years, and it's possible that those journalists could be jailed in the meantime. But that would be a decision of the courts at the different levels. But essentially, we're seeing that there'll be a test case trying to match the government's powers to impose to keep certain secrets against those of the public's right to know and the journalist's duty to inform the public.
And what are the implications of this case?
Well, I mean, as you pointed out right at the beginning, I mean, Finland is not only famed for its high levels of press freedom, it currently ranks number 2, I think, in the World Press Freedom Index. And when you get a country such as Finland, where you see journalists being prosecuted, potentially facing up to 4 years in jail, that sends a really, really worrying message, both to Finnish journalists and to journalists around the world. This will take 5 years, could take up to 5 years to resolve, and in the meantime, it will have an undoubted chilling effect on the work of journalists, both in Finland and further afield. That's no question.
Thank you so much, Oliver. We will keep monitoring this closely, and in the coming months, we will do other updates on the situation in Finland and in other MFRR countries. Thank you so much for joining us today. Next in MFRR In Focus news webinar is Antje Schlaff from ECPMF to present us the statistics from Mapping Media Freedom from the previous month. Antje, what stands out on the Mapping Media Freedom platform this year and in the past month?
Thank you, Gürkan. On the Mapping Media platform, where we document press and media freedom violations, we already have now more than 6,100 press and media freedom violations since the start of our monitoring. And only this year, we already documented more than 550 alerts for European Union member states and candidate countries. Out of these 550 alerts, we documented physical attacks, verbal attacks, attacks to property, legal incidents, as well as censorship. And today we focus on the legal incidents. We already have this year 143 incidents here, and this makes up to 1 in 4 incident being a legal incident. So with the focus to legal incidents, we can ask, okay, what type of attacks happen are included in those? So we have several civil lawsuits being 1 in 5 incident included. Arrest, detention, imprisonment, criminal charges, interrogation, legal measures, so laws restricting press and media freedom, surveillance, interception of journalistic data. But legal incidents can also be accompanied with verbal attacks such as intimidation, threatening, or also physical attacks like physical assault resulting in injuries. When we ask who performs legal incidents, we see 35% are performed by police and state security. We also have several cases performed by judiciary or legislation, but also private individuals are involved, for example, when it comes to civil lawsuits. And when we ask where do these attacks happen, most of them happen at the court, but we also documented several cases happen during protests or at the police station or other police environment or in the office or public places and streets. That's all from my side. Back to Gürkan.
Thank you, Andrea, for sharing the details on mapping media freedom. And next in our news webinar is a recorded interview with Greek journalist Stavros Malihoudis, conducted by Jamie Weisman of IPI. We are going to watch the interview now.
Earlier this month, the Greek newspaper FC published revelatory articles in which it indicated that the Greek government's National Intelligence Service has secretly been conducting monitoring on Stavros Malihoudis, a journalist with AFP and the investigative outlet Solomon. The alleged surveillance has posed serious questions over source confidentiality, protection in Greece, and the right to privacy. And Greece is already facing growing concerns over a decline in media freedom over the past year. And it's also raised fresh scrutiny over pressure against journalists who are reporting on refugees and migrants. So I'm joined now by Stavros. If we could just start, if you could just tell me a little bit about how you found out about this alleged surveillance and what kind of articles you were reporting on at the time.
Sure, Jamie, and thanks a lot for the introduction. I cover migration in Greece for the past years, and this was an article about a 12-year-old boy in the island of Kos who was living under detention and from Syria and made a painting which made it to the front page of Le Monde. So this was purely an article about this boy, his experience, what made him do the painting, and how his life in this detention center where he had been for 5 months, when I heard about his story, was. I learned about the surveillance by actually just scrolling on Facebook and seeing some of the screenshots that I've seen revealed in the report. And it was a very, very specific and very precise message from the intelligence, from the internal communication of the intelligence agency. So in that moment, I knew that it had to be me because I had covered the story with a colleague for Solomon. And then it was also confirmed to me that it was my name, the name of the journalist that was mentioned in that specific internal communication message.
And it indicated, I understand, that both of they were requesting monitoring on your work, but also that it indicated that surveillance had been happening in some form or another in the past. Basically a smoking gun in this case. So when presented with these allegations, what has the response of the authorities been so far?
The authorities, on the first day after the allegations, on the first working day after the allegations, the representative of the government kind of confirmed that they happened, and he justified it by saying that this is contained in the Act of National Security Protection. But a week later, when there was a request from more media organizations and news agencies and media watchdogs about the case, the Minister of State wrote back, and he said that Greece fully respects human law and the right to report, and that we can be sure that Mr. Malihoudis, myself, has never been under surveillance. So it was a bit contradictory response with a difference of a few days.
So I guess we've seen, on the one hand, the denial, on the other, clear evidence which suggests that the monitoring did take place. Okay, and I mean, how has this kind of affected your work, your journalistic work, when you're dealing with sources, your digital security? What kind of effect has this had?
Yeah, I have honestly stopped using my phone because we know that the monitoring had happened through tracking the phone calls. This has affected me in that sense, for sure. It's before I would call someone just to have a small talk or to see how they're doing in their field and what updates there are. Now this is gone for now, and of course it has made me and all of us colleagues here at Solomon and other media very concerned about how we can keep the privacy of people who talk to us and how we can keep them protected. Because, for example, in some cases when we have to do with human rights abuses and reporting on that, we might talk and interview with people who are maybe undocumented. So this would put them in danger while they share information for us that we find crucial for our work. We don't want this to come at the expense of themselves. And this is something we really need to think about.
So it gets a fairly chilling effect on those reporting on these issues in Greece. This is obviously an extreme case, but what are the kinds of pressures, obstruction reporters covering this topic facing in Greece right now, including yourself?
I would say that the most frequent and most widespread kind of oppression is that you never get answers on what you need from the specific Ministry of Migration. So you can wait for weeks or for months. You can try, by phone call or by email, or you can do a FOIA. You will never get a response. If you have a report that could be troubling for the government, if you report on the government with a positive and kind of advertisement way, then you will surely have the chance to also interview the minister himself. So this is one thing. And the second thing is that, of course, access to camps. When we talk about the refugee camps, it was limited, and now it's not possible because they have been transformed to closed centers with extreme surveillance measures, and it's practically impossible to enter a camp and to meet people where they live.
Okay, multitude of pressures there. Just going back to the alleged surveillance quickly, just to finish then, are you aware of any initiatives or actions to kind of raise this at the European level right now, to question Greek authorities at the international sphere?
I think there has been lots of effort on this side. Since day one, I have to say that there have been many initiatives, many public statements, many letters to the government. There have been questions in the European Parliament. There have been complaints raised by media watchdogs like the International Press Institute. So there has been real attention, also from the Journalists Union. But I wouldn't say that this has resulted to anything more since. So we have this response, which was around 2 weeks ago, that doesn't like the minister in the response doesn't need to justify why and if this document in the newspaper, because we have a document, was it false, was it fabricated? There is no response on this. So I think that the government simply lets the whole situation go.
Well, I suppose until we have clear answers, it will just encourage further scrutiny. So Stavros, thanks very much for joining us. We appreciate your time.
Thank you very much, Jamie.
Thanks.
Thank you, Jamie and Stavros. And now we proceed to our panel discussion on the situation of journalists covering borders with two distinguished guests from Poland and Greece. Paula Rosa from OBCT is going to lead the discussion this month. Paula?
Migration has always been connected with the important role of journalism. And being Christmas not so far from us now, I'd like to remind of what we in Italy call the Christmas Shipwreck. It was the 26th of December, 1996, and 283 people died in the Mediterranean between Malta and the coast of Italy, of Sicily, of Europe. And it was the biggest shipwreck in Europe after World War II. But authorities denied that it had happened, and they did it for years. Fishermen kept on fishing corpses and personal belongings, and only journalists were the witnesses of that. And till a journalist from La Repubblica hired underwater camera to show the world those corpses that were waiting for justice. And a trial was then celebrated. So justice was done, but it was only because of the courage, of the strength of journalists. Here we are today to pay homage to this courage, because migration is still a big issue, and the courage of journalists is still important to come to the truth, to tell what's happening in reality. Let me introduce you our guests. we will be talking with Claudia Ciobanu, working for Balkan Insights. Welcome, Claudia.
Thanks for having me.
And with Katie Fallon, a freelance working in Greece, reporting from Greece.
Hi, thanks for having me.
And so we are talking about the borders of Europe, and what's been happening in the last 20-25 years since the Christmas shipwreck seems to be a pattern that repeats over and over. And we have journalists just trying to tell the truth. Claudia had a personal experience of being banned from the border between Poland and Belarus, because along this border, the police authorities are creating a red zone. So there's kind of a deep sea, and we need journalists to know what's happening beyond that. Claudia, the stage is yours.
Okay, so what is happening at the Polish-Belarus border on the Polish side, I mean, a part of the migration, that you know the backstory to it, but for the past over 2 months, the Polish government has imposed a state of emergency over a stretch, a 3-kilometer wide stretch of land all along the border, north to south. That means that journalists are not allowed in, but more so even activists or doctors who want to help the migrants are not allowed in. So only the people who actually live in that region are allowed to move around freely. So basically that means that, you know, it's been extremely difficult to report from the border, because that's where, up until they imposed the state of emergency, since when it all started in Poland, since August up until the end of September, September, this is where the reporting was happening, because we could, you know, meet the migrants that had just crossed into Poland. We could see what state they're in. We could listen to their accounts of how they had been, you know, pushed back and forth multiple times. That's the typical experience. We could see, you know, their physical condition. So that hasn't been possible. The government has actually changed now the terms. So instead of the state of emergency, because they can't constitutionally prolong it longer than 2 months, they've now said they do allow journalists to go up to the border, but under the following conditions. The border guards decide the time, the length of the visit, the location, the route, when we can shoot footage and take photos or record, and also we have to obey their instructions at all times. So a couple of journalists have already tried this, and you know, they describe it as like a zoo or safari-like experience when you can't really do free reporting. So it's been incredibly hard to actually report from the border. Moreover, in addition to the state of emergency, there's been this increased militarization of the border zone. So the Polish government has amassed about 20,000 troops in the border. That's soldiers, police special forces, in addition to the border guards. There's also like a volunteer army corps. And what seems to be happening is a kind of, you know, lawless intimidation of all the actors that try to be neutral observers and witnesses to this situation, or that actually try to help the migrants. So that includes journalists, but that also includes human rights activists and local people. So local people have seen, you know, police storming their homes without any kind of mandates, you know, just, you know, using threat of a bigger force if they're not let in, because the police is checking if they hide migrants in their homes. Activists have seen themselves, you know, dragged out of cars and intimidated and told they can't move around freely, even outside them in the emergency zone. And journalists have had all sorts of experience. Mine was, I would say, a mild one, finally, compared to what we've later heard from other colleagues. But we were stopped at a checkpoint that, you know, separates this state of emergency zone from the rest of Poland. And it was in the middle of the night. We were, you know, on our way to an intervention, like, so basically to meet migrants that had made it into Poland. and we were stopped over, and we were forced to give the IMEI numbers from our phones. That's like a number of the hardware of the phone that allows tracking of the location of the device. And yeah, I believe we were, threatened with arrest because the officials that were there, which was police and border guards, they said that they were joking with us, and they were saying that you are in the state of emergency zone now, even if we weren't, basically implying that they can arrest us in any moment. So that was our experience, but we've had also journalists that were, kept handcuffed by unidentified people in uniform that, refuse to say like who they are and what kind of, mandate they are executing. And this was outside of the state of emergency zone. And we've had journalists harassed also by this volunteer army corps. That's kind of, whose legitimacy for action of this type is really fuzzy. So it's hard to work at the border right now.
So these are the facts, and abuses and intimidations happen not only in Poland, but also in Greece. So that's the experience made by Katie.
Sure. So the situation in Greece is similar and also quite different. I mean, there have been arrivals on the land and on the island borders for many years now. So it's a different context to the Belarus-Polish border. But the border areas have always been highly militarized zones. So reporting from there is always a bit challenging because a lot of the coastline, particularly on the islands, is militarized. You have to have special permission to document it. And recently, it's been increasingly difficult to report because, especially with the creation of these new camps, it's quite difficult to get access to people living in them. You can finally get access, but often it's with, you're accompanied by policemen. And so it's not exactly the sort of situation in which you feel comfortable speaking to people freely living in the camp and asking them questions. So there is access, but in a sort of quite monitored context. And there have also been, I have experienced myself being stopped by police, detained, had my ID checked. My experience has actually been quite minor compared to some other people, particularly journalists who have gone to landings, which have become a very tense situation in Greece because there's been many highly documented cases of pushbacks where people arrive on the Greek islands and are then illegally expelled before they've had the chance to claim asylum. And by that, I mean very well documented reports of how people are put on life rafts and then left out in the middle of the sea. So there have been cases of journalists who've gone to arrivals to document people who have been detained, who have been arrested, threatened with many different charges, including espionage. There was a case last November of some journalists on the island of Samos who were detained, strip searched, threatened with charges of espionage. And this, it doesn't happen all the time, but this does happen. There have also been journalists detained at the land border with Turkey and similarly threatened with charges of espionage. And so reporting in this context is also very tense, very difficult at points. And even if you show your press card, it's not always enough to for the authorities to sort of leave you alone. I mean, the situation here is, like I said, evolving. It used to be that the camps were kind of like Moria, were sort of spaces where people could come and go freely. You could chat to them. It was easier to sort of understand what was going on. Now they've become these sort of closed spaces, which are highly monitored. They're policed. They have walls built around them. And taking photographs of them, a lot of camps are considered military zones or can arbitrarily be designated as military zones by whichever police officer is in charge. So they can also accuse you of taking photographs of a military space, which also can lead to espionage charges. There have also been recently very troubling reports of journalists reporting on migration in Greece who are being monitored by the Greek security services. There was a colleague, a Greek colleague, who writes a lot about migration, who found out through an article published in Greek media through some leaked documents that he was the subject of surveillance by the Greek security services because he was writing an article about a young refugee boy living in a camp on the Greek island of Kos. The Greek authorities deny this is happening, but there seems to be proof which suggests otherwise. So this is the context in Greece. It's different, but there's similar issues that journalists are also experiencing along the Polish-Belarusian border as well.
Another issue experienced in Greece by Katie herself is being banned from a court. So we have been talking about security zones and militarized sea, militarized waters or land. But how can a journalist be banned from a court?
Yes, I forgot to mention that. There was too many to talk about. Well, this was the case of Sean Binder, Sarah Mardini, who are amongst a group of aid workers who are accused of espionage, human trafficking, many other charges. And this was one part of a trial of many potential trials, which happened a few weeks ago. We turned up at the court, and it's supposed to be that if you're a journalist, you should be allowed entry. They have an open court system in that sense. But we were told on arrival that even though we had vaccine certificates, that we wouldn't be allowed to go inside because there wasn't enough space. I mean, they just said COVID was the reason. There was no real reason given. And I mean, we had our documents checked multiple times and we were allowed to remain outside the court. But obviously that was a very different experience waiting outside in the courtyard outside the courthouse than actually being present in the courtroom itself to witness and understand what was going on in the trial from a first-hand perspective. So yeah, that was also a very difficult situation. And as I understand it, is not the first time in which journalists have been prevented from entering a courthouse for sort of seemingly arbitrary reasons.
I can confirm it happened in Italy last year using using the pandemic as an excuse. But it happened for the trial against a mafia organization. But then, thanks to a call and to statements made by the European Federation of Journalists, the ban was lifted. It took a month, but then a solution was found. So I'm just suggesting that there could be ways to counter these bans. Claudia, what is your experience of justice along the borders?
Actually, about COVID excuse, what the Polish authorities are using it for is to ban us from visiting the migrant centers on the Polish territory, because most of the people who try to enter, they get pushed back and forth. As you know, some of them end up being deported, some of them make it to Germany, but there's a small number of them that get detained in Polish refugee camps. So we consider them now the lucky ones because they get at least to register their asylum applications. But it has become, I've been trying to visit these centers since August. In August, it was they made it procedurally extremely complicated. It seemed to still be possible, but it involved like me describing in detail the article and then posting it apparently on a notice board on the walls of the center. So it doesn't matter. But now it's a blanket ban because of COVID. And even when I say that there are migrants inside that want to speak to me, giving names that I want to interview these specific people and I can do it in the courtyard, they still say it doesn't apply. So basically, they try to shut down access to migrants in any shape and form. But when it comes to justice system, the situation is pretty new in Poland. So we haven't gotten in many cases the court stage. But I can tell you a few things. The problem in the specificity of Poland, perhaps, is that court rulings and the justice system is irrelevant at the moment to the Polish government. So whether it's especially if it's European courts deciding, which used to have an impact in member states, the Polish government just doesn't care. So we've got a bunch of European Court of Human Rights rulings on specific cases of refugees that have come in, and so, for example, the court is issuing interim ruling that that humanitarian aid should be allowed into this specific group or that specific group, and the Polish government is just not implementing that. So, and also when you spoke about pressure from European journalism federations and things like that, the amount of international statements we have seen since this crisis started in Poland, from every possible actor, to just provide basically food and housing to these people, temporary, not to give them asylum, just to respect basic rights and not let them die in the fields, has been extraordinary. I mean, there's been a huge mobilization, and it's really, I don't believe it makes a difference. It's nice to feel the solidarity. So, for example, in our situation, we've seen a lot of statements put out from different groups, and it really feels like you're not alone. But in terms of impact on the Polish government, I'm afraid I'm quite skeptical. I'm not saying it's always going to be like that, but at the moment, I don't think it makes any difference, I'm afraid.
Between pessimism and a look at the rule of law functioning, and we are coming to the conclusions, and we would like to hear from you. What could be the solution? So we can propose advocacy, pressure, and there's also the side of the audience. And we unluckily, in Italy, for example, we have journalists covering migration issues who are attacked by the audience. And so they face a double, a triple threat. But there might be solutions suggested by the ground. That's a positive way to conclude our panel, I think. Katie.
Gosh, positive solutions. I mean, I can sympathize with people getting attacked for their work because it happens a lot online to me more recently, and it's very challenging. And as much as people say it doesn't have, you should ignore your trolls, it gets to you after a while, and definitely makes you question whether you want to continue doing it. The solidarity helps, for sure. The statements from other journalist groups, the solidarity, the feedback, the positive feedback you get from people who read your work really helps. I'm afraid, like Claudia, I feel slightly pessimistic about the ability of sort of these statements to change anything. Ultimately, it comes down to the way in which Brussels responds to EU member states, treating aid workers and journalists in this manner. And unless it's really dealt with in not just a verbal way, but an actual sort of like measures taken, rather than kind of tweets or expressions of solidarity from sort of European Parliament members, which of course is important, it doesn't seem likely to change. And I think that's going to be the real test of whether the European Union is truly going to stand up for its values or not. So, I mean, I think we will only see real change when it seems like there's a desire for real practical change on the ground in Brussels to kind of respond in a sort of real way to actions and infringements made by member states.
Yeah, I fully agree, Katie. I mean, in the case of Poland, just a couple of days ago, the European Commission actually proposed relaxing, the EU asylum procedure. So unless there's determined action from the EU, which there won't be, because we know what's the political line in Brussels at the moment, the direction of the Polish government is not going to change. They've got no reason to. But I am optimistic when I look at the grassroots. So what we have seen in Poland for the past 3-4 months is an incredible mobilization on the grassroots level. You know, all the local, like groups of locals that are, you know, there on the front line and they give aid to the migrants. NGOs that have done really superb mobilization to, you know, come and meet the migrants just outside the state of emergency zone. Volunteer paramedics that have been there on the ground, you know, out of their own initiative. And I believe that all these people are collecting the stories. We are also collecting stories in the patchy way that we can. And, you know, what I've been thinking lately is that, you know, the Polish government may try in different bizarre ways to block our access, but we are telling the story anyway, and we are going to tell the story, and we're going to patch up all these details, and we are going to have on record the story of this massive human rights abuses committed at the moment on the Polish-Belarusian border. We've been saying it, but we'll say it with more details, and, you know, they can't hide the truth anyhow.
They can't hide the truth. And the truth on the ground is the topic that journalists are working with. That's why we warmly thank you, Claudia Ciobanu and Katie Fallon, for telling us stories from the border of Europe, stories that have to be heard all over the European Union in Brussels too. Thank you very much.
Thanks, and thanks for your solidarity as well.
Thank you.
Thank you, Paula, and also to our guests. And thank you for watching us this month. You may find more information on mappingmediafreedom.org and on MFRR's activities on mfrr.eu, as well as our newsletter, also titled MFRR in Focus. Thank you for watching us.